Somewhere beneath the hills and hollows of the Ozarks, people have been whispering about tunnels for centuries, passages that run too straight to be natural, chambers sealed off without explanation, routes that locals swear were used by someone or something long before anyone thought to write it down. Now, some of these stories have perfectly reasonable explanations rooted in geology, in mining history, in the practical needs of people who had good reasons to move underground. Others remain genuinely unresolved, sitting in that uncomfortable space where the evidence doesn't quite add up and historians aren't sure what to make of it. That's exactly what we're going to explore tonight. The caves and sinkholes that define this landscape, the documented human-made works that carve deeper into it, the folklore that grew around both, and the claims that still don't have clean answers. We're not here to sell you a mystery. We're here to lay out what's known, what's contested, and what the earth beneath the Ozarks might actually be holding. Before we go underground, if you find this channel useful, a like and a subscribe genuinely helps these stories reach more people. Now, let's begin. To understand any tunnel story coming out of the Ozarks, you have to start with the ground itself, because the ground there is not like ground most people picture when they hear the word. It doesn't sit solid and inert beneath your feet. It shifts, it dissolves, it opens. The Ozarks are one of the oldest upland regions in North America, a broad dome of ancient rock covering roughly 47,000 square miles across southern Missouri, northern Arkansas, and smaller portions of Oklahoma and Kansas. The core of that dome is dolomite and limestone laid down hundreds of millions of years ago when shallow seas covered the interior of the continent. That detail matters enormously because limestone doesn't just sit there. It reacts. When rainwater filters through soil, it picks up carbon dioxide and becomes weakly acidic. Carbonic acid, that acidic water moves down through cracks and joints in the limestone, and over thousands and millions of years it dissolves the rock. Not dramatically, not visibly, just steadily, relentlessly, grain by grain and molecule by molecule. The result is what geologists call karst terrain. The Ozarks are one of the most extensively developed karst landscapes in the United States. What karst looks like on the surface is sinkholes, springs, disappearing streams that vanish into the earth and reappear miles away. Dry valleys that once held rivers now drained underground. What karst looks like below the surface is a labyrinth. Voids connected to other voids. Passages that wind for miles without ever seeing daylight. Chambers large enough to hold buildings. Missouri alone has more than 6,000 documented caves. Arkansas has over 2,000 more. Those are only the ones someone has found an entrance to and bothered to record. The actual number of underground spaces in the Ozarks, including sealed and inaccessible ones, is almost certainly much higher. This is the first thing that has to be understood before a single tunnel story makes any sense. The Ozarks are already full of holes. They were full of holes before any human being arrived. The mystery isn't that there are underground passages beneath the Ozarks. The mystery, when it exists, is determining who made which ones, and why. Now, karst terrain creates several distinct types of underground spaces, and they're easy to confuse from the outside. A traversable cave is what most people picture when they hear the word. A passage large enough to walk through, with a ceiling overhead and a floor underfoot, often with formations like stalactites and flowstone built up over thousands of years. These exist throughout the Ozarks in great numbers. Some have been commercially developed, and you can buy tickets to walk through them. Others are known only to dedicated cavers with ropes and lights and the willingness to squeeze through gaps that would make most people rethink their life choices. Then there are narrow fissures. These are cracks in the rock, sometimes vertically oriented, sometimes running horizontally for considerable distances, but too tight for a person to pass through. They feel significant when you find one. Air moves through them. Sound does strange things near them. Water drains into them. But they're not passageways in any useful sense, and yet people standing at the edge of a fissure that breathes cold air and disappears into darkness have been telling tunnel stories ever since they arrived in the Ozarks. And then there are mined passages. The Ozarks sit on top of enormous mineral deposits, lead and zinc primarily, but also iron and other ores. Human beings have been cutting into the rock to reach those minerals for a very long time. Some of those excavations go back further than the written record in this region. Others date to the 18th and 19th centuries when mining operations left behind shafts, adits, and horizontal passages that, a few generations later, look remarkably like something else entirely. A mined passage and a natural passage can be difficult to distinguish without close examination. And if the examination never happens, both get folded into the same category of mysterious underground thing. The difficulty is compounded by the fact that the Ozark cave network is genuinely fragmented and genuinely hard to map. Unlike a river system where you can trace water from mountain to sea, cave systems here are often disconnected. A passage that appears to lead somewhere terminates at a wall of collapsed rock or a sump filled with water. Another passage begins a quarter mile away with no apparent connection to the first, yet hydrological dye tracing, where scientists pour dye into one water source and watch where it emerges, has demonstrated that water does move between them. The rock is connected in ways that human bodies cannot follow. This fragmentation creates enormous space for rumor. If a local farmer in 1880 explored a cave entrance on his property and followed a passage for 200 feet before it became too tight to continue, he had no way of knowing whether that passage connected to the one his neighbor had found on the adjacent property. To him, it might have looked like a single continuous tunnel running under the entire ridge. It might have felt engineered, purposeful, deliberate. He might have told that story for the rest of his life, passed it to his children, and been completely sincere. He might also have been completely wrong. This is not a flaw unique to uneducated frontier people. Professional cavers today still encounter sections of the Ozark underground that resist mapping because the passages become impassable before they can be traced. The gaps in human knowledge about what lies beneath these hills are real and are not likely to be fully resolved anytime soon. There's another feature of Ozark geology that feeds the mystery, and that's the springs. The region has some of the largest freshwater springs in the country. Big Spring in Missouri discharges an average of 286 million gallons of water per day. Mammoth Spring in Arkansas is similarly staggering. These springs emerge from the hillsides with force and volume that makes one thing immediately obvious. Enormous quantities of water have been moving through enormous underground spaces to arrive here. Where there is water passage at that scale, there is void. The passages that fed the great Ozark springs had to be large. Many of them still are, somewhere beneath the surface where no one has yet traveled. Early settlers saw those springs and understood, correctly, that significant underground spaces existed nearby. What they didn't always have was the geological framework to distinguish a natural dissolution cave from an engineered tunnel. A passage smoothed by centuries of water flow can look, in the uncertain light of a torch or lantern, disconcertingly regular. Walls that have been chemically polished by moving water can appear cut. Ceilings that formed along horizontal bedding planes can appear level in a way that suggests human intention. The Ozarks also experience significant karst collapse events. Sinkholes opened suddenly in fields that appeared solid for decades. Springs change course without warning. Known cave passages become blocked by breakdown, which is the term for rock that has collapsed from the ceiling over time. This dynamic, unstable underground environment means that whatever was there 50 years ago may not be accessible today, and whatever is accessible today may not have been accessible to the people who first told the stories. Evidence, if it existed, may be sealed behind tons of fallen limestone, or it may have never been there at all. The landscape doesn't give clean answers. What this means for every tunnel story that will follow in this history is that the Ozarks provide both the raw material for the mystery and the explanation for why it persists. The caves are real, the voids are real, the difficulty of mapping and verifying them is real. A region with 6,000 documented caves and an unknown number of undocumented ones is a region where an underground rumor can circulate for generations without ever being fully confirmed or fully disproven. The land itself holds ambiguity the way limestone holds water. So before we talk about who might have used these passages, who might have made them, what might have moved through them in the dark, the foundation is this: the Ozarks are a landscape built for secrecy. Not because of anything humans did, because of the chemistry of ancient rock and the patience of acidic water moving through it across geological time. The underground world here is vast, fragmented, poorly understood, and genuinely strange. That was true before the first human being ever set foot on these hills. Every story that came after, simply moved into a space that was already waiting. Before French trappers, before county surveyors, before anyone wrote the word Ozarks in a ledger, people were already moving across these hills and into these openings in the rock. When we talk about mysterious tunnels, we're joining a conversation that is thousands of years old, and most of the original voices in that conversation are gone. Archaeologists use different culture names for the ancient inhabitants of this region: archaic, woodland, Mississippian. Later, written records talk about Osage, Quapaw, Caddo, and others with ties to this upland country. The boundaries aren't neat. People moved. Groups split, merged, were displaced. But the basic point is simple. The Ozarks are not an empty stage that Europeans walked onto and discovered. They are a lived-in landscape, with a very long indigenous history that included an intimate familiarity with what lay under the surface. We know this not because someone left us a convenient diary of cave use, but because of what has turned up in the earth. Throughout the broader Ozark region, caves and rock shelters have yielded stone tools, pottery fragments, fire pits, plant remains, animal bones, and human burials. Some of these deposits are thousands of years old. They show that people came into these places for shelter, for storage, for burial, and almost certainly for reasons that don't survive well in the archaeological record, like ceremony and story. Underground spaces, especially caves near reliable springs, offered obvious practical advantages. They were cooler in the summer, warmer in the winter. A dry ledge under rock could protect food stores from weather. A spring issuing from the base of a bluff provided consistent water even in drought. Caves could function as temporary camps, hunting bases, hideouts during conflict, or places to cache goods. None of that requires legend. It just requires common sense and familiarity with a difficult landscape. But in many indigenous traditions across North America, caves and springs were never just practical. They were cosmological, places where powerful things happened, places where beings emerged or retreated, portals in a layered universe. We do have recorded examples, from cultures both inside and outside the immediate Ozarks, of beliefs that tie underground spaces to origins, to underworlds, to spirit realms, to deities associated with water or fertility or danger. The problem, historically, is that most of what we know about those beliefs comes through filters. Missionaries writing in the 18th and 19th centuries condensed complex spiritual systems into a few pages of text. Government agents summarized what they heard in reports meant for superiors who were not especially interested in nuance. Anthropologists arrived after waves of disease, displacement, and forced removals had already torn communities apart. By the time anyone started to systematically record indigenous knowledge in this region, much had been disrupted. So we move carefully. We can say with confidence that many indigenous nations in and around the Ozarks understood the land as alive, relational, and spiritually charged. We can say that caves and springs were often among the most charged places in that system. We can say that some of those places were used for burials, which in itself tells us they carried weight beyond daily convenience. What we cannot do responsibly is take a specific 20th century tunnel story and announce that it secretly encodes an ancient ceremony without clear, traceable evidence. This is where the temptation to project backward becomes strong. A modern listener hears that a certain cave was taboo or sacred to local tribes and immediately imagines elaborate underground rituals, lost chambers, secret routes known only to shamans. Maybe something like that existed. Maybe something very different existed. Or maybe the only restriction was practical. Don't disturb burials. Don't drink from that spring at certain times. Don't shout in that chamber because the echoes are associated with a particular being. The truth is, in most specific cases, we just don't know. There's another layer of distortion. When Euro-American settlers arrived in greater numbers in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they stepped into a knowledge system about the land that had been evolving for millennia. They did not necessarily understand it, and they did not arrive as neutral observers. Land was something to be owned, platted, sold, and exploited. Caves were potential sources of saltpeter for gunpowder, cool spaces to store perishables, or curiosities to be explored and claimed. Accounts from the 1800s sometimes mention Indian caves or old Indian paths. The wording tells you immediately whose perspective is being recorded. These were not indigenous descriptions of sacred spaces. They were settlers labeling anything that predated them with a single broad category: Indian. A burial cave with carefully placed remains might become, in the settlers' retelling, a mass grave after a great battle, whether or not there was any evidence of violence. A rock art panel might transform into mysterious signs. A practical footpath that followed the easiest grade between two valleys might be elevated into a secret war trail or hidden tunnel entrance, especially once memories of who actually made and used the path had faded. Over time, indigenous knowledge about specific springs, sinkholes, and caves was often repackaged to fit new narrative needs. A place that had been avoided out of respect might be recast as a spot the Indians feared, adding an aura of danger that made it attractive to adventurous settlers and later to tourists. A cave that had stored sacred items might be retold as a lost treasure site. These reinterpretations weren't necessarily malicious. Often they were simply misunderstandings, transmitted and embroidered over generations, but they still changed the stories attached to the land. When we look at later tunnel tales across the Ozarks, there are hints that some of them may contain fragments of that older knowledge, stripped of context. Stories about passages that follow ridges in particular ways. Accounts of underground routes linking specific springs or crossing under certain divides. Legends that describe moving through the earth from one drainage basin to another, roughly tracing what hydrologists would later confirm as underground water routes. None of this proves deliberate tunnel construction by ancient peoples. It does suggest that people who lived close to the land were paying attention to how water and stone interact, and were encoding that in oral traditions in ways that later listeners could easily mistake for talk about literal tunnels. There is also a more mundane possibility. In a landscape riddled with sinkholes, small caves, and seasonal openings, it wouldn't take much for indigenous travelers to develop short underground shortcuts or sheltered waypoints, places where you slipped into rock for 100 feet to avoid exposure, or where a low passage allowed you to pop out in a different hollow unseen. Those are not the grand engineered corridors of romantic imagination. They are tiny, practical uses of an already perforated landscape. But in a settler's memory, or in a story retold 150 years later, the distinction between "we cut a tunnel" and "we used a cave that happened to be there" can vanish. Keeping the distinctions clear matters. We have firm archaeological evidence that indigenous peoples used caves in the Ozarks for shelter, burial, storage, and likely ceremony. We have rock art, tools, and human remains in specific documented sites. We have ethnographic and historical hints that underground and water emergent places held spiritual importance. We do not have reliable evidence of continent-spanning, human-made tunnel systems constructed by ancient nations under these hills. That doesn't make the indigenous dimension of Ozark tunnel lore any less important. It simply means we acknowledge the limits of what can be said honestly. When a modern tunnel story mentions old Indian passages, it may be echoing a real memory of indigenous cave use. It may be echoing a settler misunderstanding of that use. It may be a complete invention added for atmosphere. Often, we can't separate those possibilities cleanly. As we move forward into periods with more written records, we'll see how French traders, Spanish officials, American settlers, miners, and soldiers all layered their own needs and fears onto this already complex underground. The indigenous presence is the foundation beneath all of that. The tunnels in the stories may or may not be real. The people who were here long before those stories were written down absolutely were. By the time Europeans started writing about this region, they were stepping into a world that was already mapped in other people's minds. But on paper, on the maps, and in the reports that survive, the Ozarks begin to appear as a kind of edge space. A borderland between claims, between empires, between things known and things left as blank patches of ink. In the 17th and 18th centuries, French traders and missionaries pushed out along the Mississippi and its tributaries. They followed river corridors north and south, then west toward the interior plateaus. In their journals, this upland mass is not yet the Ozarks. It's part of a vague upper Louisiana, a hinterland of hills, mountains, broken country. You can feel the hesitation. They knew the rivers. They did not always know what lay between them. Then there were the Spanish. On paper, Spain controlled enormous slices of this interior after treaties shuffled colonial possessions back and forth. Spanish officials in St. Louis or New Orleans received reports that spoke of serranias, sierras, mineral prospects, and difficult crossings in what we would now call the Ozark region. They sent out inspectors. They issued land grants. They drafted maps. On those maps, you sometimes see little symbols that mark cuevas or grottas along the river bluffs. Caves as landmarks, not mysteries, just part of the terrain. Early travelers noticed other things too. They wrote about salt licks, salt springs, and saltpeter caves. Saltpeter, potassium nitrate, was already valuable for gunpowder. Any cave with promising deposits merited a note. Some accounts mention vast caverns, subterraneous passages, great holes in the rock that the Indians fear. The phrasing varies, but the pattern is familiar. Impressive openings, uncertain extent, second-hand comments about indigenous attitudes, a quick move on to the next subject. The maps of this era can be strangely precise about rivers and strangely vague about everything else. A limestone bluff with a cave mouth might be drawn as a small, neat arch symbol. A valley honeycombed with sinkholes and small openings might be summed up with a few words: rugged, broken, difficult, to a modern reader, hungry for proof. That single arch symbol can look like a smoking gun. A mark that says, here is the entrance to something bigger. This is where interpretation starts to drift. A French officer in 1750 might have meant, very literally, there is a cave here by the river. No more, no less. 2 centuries later, a local historian might look at the same symbol, combine it with a family story about hidden passages, and decide it indicates the mouth of a man-made tunnel system. The original meaning was modest. The later reading is expansive. You see the same tension in travel narratives. An 18th century priest might write that the savages have secret retreats in the mountains. They withdraw there when threatened. That could refer to rock shelters, overhangs, or any rough hideout. It doesn't specify carving, masonry, or engineering. But once the phrase secret retreats is in print, it can be retold as secret underground refuges, then as tunnels, and eventually as a network of tunnels used to escape pursuit. The frontier conditions encouraged that kind of imagination. This was a world of small, scattered posts, packed animal hides, and trade goods moving along dangerous routes. If you're hauling furs, lead, or contraband alcohol through contested territory, you don't broadcast your path. You use cover, you travel at night, you hug ridgelines and creek beds. And if there's a cave or a sheltered overhang along the way, you might stash things there, at least for a time. It doesn't take much for that basic logic. Hide things where they're hard to find, to shift into more dramatic stories. A cache of trade goods found decades later in a dry cave can be retold as loot hidden after a raid. A lead ingot in a crevice might become evidence of Spanish tunnels dug to move ore in secret. Frontier smuggling, whether it involved untaxed spirits, enslaved people, or simply goods that crossed imperial lines without paperwork, could easily feed rumors of hidden routes. The reality may have been a series of ad hoc hiding spots and short natural passages. The memory becomes a continuous, deliberate, underground road. What's missing from these colonial records is any clear, detailed description of engineered subterranean networks under the Ozark Plateau. There are mentions of mines and pits, of shafts and galleries in later 18th century and early 19th century documents as lead and other minerals drew attention. But those are localized works, a shaft down to an ore body, a gallery following a vein, not a tunnel that thoughtfully connects distant towns or valleys. The distinction matters. A reference to a mine is not the same as evidence of a tunnel highway. A note about subterranean passages in a single cavern is not the same as proof that those passages were cut, lined, and extended by human hands. Natural caves can be sprawling, confusing, and interconnected in ways that feel designed when you're inside them in the dark. To someone in the 1700s, stumbling into a cave with multiple branches and air moving faintly from some unseen opening, the impression of a labyrinth or ways under the mountain would be hard to resist. Over time, those impressions accumulate. A trader mentions a big cave. A Spanish official writes about a subterraneous path where a stream disappears. A missionary repeats a story that the Indians pass under the hills. None of these lines by itself claims a purpose-built tunnel grid, but once they're gathered into later county histories, tourist brochures, or family lore, they can be stitched into a narrative. The French knew of secret tunnels. The Spanish used them to guard treasure. The early Americans inherited them without understanding their origins. In that stitched-together narrative, the blank areas on colonial maps become places to pour mystery into. The single cave symbol becomes the entrance to a forgotten system. The offhand remark about a secret retreat becomes evidence of design. The gap between what early writers actually said and what later readers want them to have meant widens quietly, almost imperceptibly, until rumor and record seem to say the same thing. They don't. The colonial era gives us the first written hints. Caves as landmarks, mineral resources, temporary shelters, maybe convenient hiding places in a dangerous borderland. It gives us the first vague phrases that later generations can lean on. But it does not give us clear, unambiguous documentation of long, constructed tunnels crisscrossing the Ozarks. That part of the story will be built later, as American settlers arrive, dig their own holes in the hills, and start to fold their experiences into a landscape already thick with rumor. When American settlers began to arrive in greater numbers in the early 19th century, they stepped into that same landscape of bluffs and sinkholes, but with a different relationship to it. For them, the Ozarks weren't a distant edge described in someone else's report. They were home, or at least a place they hoped would become home. Caves stopped being just marks on a map and turned into part of the household inventory, as practical as a spring or a good patch of bottomland. For a small cabin with no icebox, a cool, dry cave was an obvious solution to a daily problem. Families used caves as cellars before they had the resources to dig or stone line one of their own. They stored potatoes, cured meat, cider, pickled vegetables. In some places, the phrase cave milk shows up in recollections. Milk set on a rock ledge in a nearby cave to keep it from spoiling quite so fast. The underground was an improvised refrigerator and pantry. Water made caves even more valuable. In karst country, springs often issued directly from cave mouths. Settlers built cabins near cave springs for steady access, hauled water from dripping ledges inside, or led small channels out to troughs. A reliable source could be the difference between making it through a dry spell and moving on. In that sense, the cave was not mysterious at all. It was the family well, tucked into the hillside. Shelter was another layer. In storm country, a recess in the rock was a godsend. Family stories from across the Ozarks describe everyone grabbing quilts and running to the cave when a black cloud came up, or when word of raiding parties, bushwhackers, or simply hostile neighbors spread along the ridge. Sometimes the hideout was a shallow overhang barely deep enough to get out of the wind. Sometimes it was a true cavern where firelight disappeared into darkness. Either way, the association of underground space with refuge took root early. Frontier conditions gave that association teeth. This was a region of land disputes, thefts, sudden violence, and long distances between authorities. A family could be miles from the nearest court, sheriff, or neighbor strong enough to help. In that vacuum, the idea of hidden routes and escape passages had a strong appeal. If trouble came down the road, you wanted to believe there was a way to slip out of sight and reappear somewhere safer. Most of the time, the practical answer was simple: know your hills. People learned where a narrow hollow let you cross from one creek to another unseen, where an old buffalo trace wound through timber, where a ravine narrowed into a rock shelter. But in the telling, those everyday pathways and shelters began to blur into something more secretive. A way through the hill, a hole you could go in one side and come out on the next branch. Natural through caves and short crawlways could easily be described as tunnels, especially in hindsight. That's where local oral tradition starts to thicken. In county after county, you find family stories about the place they hid in the war, the cave where your great-granddaddy kept his horses, the hole where the men lay out until the posse passed. Outlaws, real or embellished, helped populate these spaces. Livestock thieves slipping horses into a cavern, small-time bandits dividing spoils in a sheltered recess, deserters from one army or another waiting out patrols in holes in the bluff. All of these become, in memory, proof of designated hideouts and secret chambers. Because so many of these communities were isolated, the story stayed local. They circulated in kitchens, at church gatherings, at country stores, long before anyone wrote them down. A tale might be told a dozen different ways within a single valley before it ever reached a newspaper. That oral circulation did two things at once. It preserved a core memory: there really had been a hiding place, a frightening night, a stash of food in the dark, and it quietly enlarged the setting each time it was told. You can trace the inflation. A grandfather remembers spending one stormy night in a shallow cave while riders passed along the road below. His children grow up hearing about the cave we hid in when the raiders came. His grandchildren, living in a calmer era, retell it as the tunnel we used to escape the raiders. By the time a local historian interviews them, the simple rock shelter may have grown into a tunnel that went clear under the hill. No one is necessarily lying. The language just shifts to match the drama of the event. Practical uses also left physical traces that invited speculation. A narrow passage widened with a pick to make a better storage nook could, generations later, look like the entrance to a constructed corridor. A low wall of stacked stones to block animals from wandering into a cave might read as the remains of some organized underground room. Piles of old jars, rusted tools, and scraps of timber in the twilight zone of a cavern seem to prove that people used to live down here. In reality, they may have been storing vegetables and harnesses, not plotting getaways. Over decades, clusters of such experiences, storm shelters, water caves, root cellars, quick hiding spots, could be stitched together into something larger. One family had a cave they ran to in bad weather. A neighbor down the hollow knew of a crevice where his grandfather claimed to have dodged armed men. Farther up the ridge, another branch of the family talked about an opening where someone once cached flour and bacon during a scare. When those narratives were retold at the same table, it became tempting to imagine these places as connected parts of a single underground network. In reality, they were usually not. They were scattered, local, and often quite small. But the pattern of retelling made them feel continuous. They had caves all through here they could get away in. There was tunnels all under this hill. Vague plurals, caves, tunnels, stand in for a string of separate sites. Over time, with each new generation adding its own layer of emphasis and interpretation, the collective memory shifts from a world of many little holes to a mental map of large, coherent systems. That shift doesn't require deception, only distance. As the immediate need for caves declined, once houses had proper cellars, once storms were monitored by radio, once law and order felt more stable, the underground moved from the center of daily life into the realm of story. The dark spaces remained in the hills. The uses that once seemed ordinary began to feel exotic. And in that change of perspective, the birth of underground legend became almost inevitable. By the mid-19th century, another reason to go underground arrived in the Ozarks, or, long before anyone talked about secret tunnels, people here talked about mineral. Lead, zinc, and associated metals became a quiet backbone of the regional economy. They also carved miles of human-made voids through the hills, then walked away and left them. Lead came first in a big way. In parts of Missouri, especially on the eastern and central edges of what people loosely call the Ozarks, shallow lead deposits were known early. French and American prospectors scratched at them in the late 1700s and early 1800s. By the 19th century, those scratches turned into pits, shafts, and drifts. Later, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, zinc joined the story, especially in the tri-state district, where Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma meet, and in pockets scattered across northern Arkansas and southern Missouri. The techniques were simple at first. If ore showed at the surface, miners dug down. A vertical shaft to follow a promising vein. A short horizontal adit, basically a tunnel driven into a hillside to reach rock at the right level. As operations grew, those adits sprouted side passages, storage cutouts, airways, and connecting drifts. Underground, the result looked like a small city plan scratched into the stone. Corridors, crosscuts, blind rooms, pillars. To someone stepping into a collapsed entrance a century later, none of that necessarily screams mine at first glance. It just reads as tunnel. Terminology matters here. A shaft is a vertical or near vertical opening, usually sunk from the surface down to reach ore. Adit is the word miners use for a horizontal passage driven into a slope. A drift is a horizontal or gently sloping tunnel that follows the ore body. Stope is where the actual ore is removed, leaving irregular chambers and ledges. On paper, those words make a tidy map. In the woods, after decades of erosion and leaf fall, they become a sinkhole, a slot in a bluff, a dark hole in the hillside. Many small mines were worked by local companies, partnerships, even extended families. Some kept careful records, others left little more than a name, a rough date, and a story that they got some lid out of there. When prices dropped, ore ran thin, or water flooded the workings, operations shut down. Entrances were boarded, fenced, or just abandoned. Over time, timbers rotted, shafts caved, adits slumped. Openings moved upslope as rock fell in and debris filled the inner reaches. Now imagine walking in a hollow where the mining stopped around 1910. The last deed transfer mentions mineral rights reserved. The company records are boxed somewhere or lost in a courthouse fire. The people who actually worked the face are long gone. The land sells, splits, and resells. A new owner in the 1960s finds a half-collapsed arch in the bluff with stacked rock on either side and a dark space beyond. He hears his grandfather mention that there was mining back in here somewhere, but no one is quite sure where. From that moment on, you no longer have a clear line between industrial excavation and mystery. Geologists and mining historians can often tell when something is man-made. Chisel marks, drill holes, squared corners, stacked stone cribbing, rails, or rotting ties are strong clues. But not every site preserves those details. In soft rock, tool marks weather away. In wet settings, timbers disintegrate completely. A slope that once held a neat adit mouth can slump into a natural-looking washout. A stope that broke into a natural cave can leave a hybrid space, part mined, part karst passage, all confusing to someone with a flashlight and no context. Incomplete records compound this. Many small or short-lived mines never made it into state bulletins or detailed maps. Others are only sketched at a scale that shows, at best, adit with an arrow and no length. Company surveys might have been done, but stayed private. When those companies dissolved, their papers were scattered, destroyed, or sold with no thought to future landowners or future historians trying to figure out why there's a brick arch in the middle of a ravine. Private ownership keeps most of these sites out of public view. A farmer may know about a hole in the hill on his back 40, but never mention it beyond family, partly out of habit, partly out of liability concerns. Someone else might quietly dump trash into an old shaft to keep cattle from breaking legs. An entrance plugged with old appliances and brush looks like a trash gully, not the mouth of a corridor that once ran deep under the ridge. As generations pass, knowledge of what's buried beneath the briars thins out. Lost entrances are a powerful engine for speculation. A story says there was a mine that went a quarter-mile under the hill. People remember wagons hauling ore. Yet all that's visible now is a depression shaped like a doorway and a faint draft of cool air. If local kids find another hole on the far side of the ridge, a natural cave, say, with a blackened ceiling from an old campfire, connecting those two becomes an obvious mental move. There must be a tunnel between them. The mining past provides a ready-made explanation for an invisible link. Over time, mining stories start to braid into broader beliefs about regional tunnel networks. In counties with a lot of old lead and zinc work, you hear phrases like, "They dug all under this town," or "There's shafts and tunnels everywhere around here." That's sometimes literally true on a local scale, hundreds of yards, even miles of workings beneath a specific district. When such comments are repeated without the mining context, they can morph into the idea that entire counties, or the whole Ozarks, are riddled with intentional tunnels used for escape, smuggling, or secret travel. Sorting out where the documented industrial excavation ends and unsupported claims begin requires patience. On one side, there are clear records, mine inspector reports, engineering drawings, photographs of head frames and ore bins, physical traces of rails and machinery. You can stand at some sinkhole in the woods, compare old maps, and say with confidence, "This was the main adit of the such-and-such mine. It ran roughly east-west for 600 feet, with drifts north and south." On the other side are descriptions that float free of verifiable mining. Tunnels said to connect a courthouse to a church with no geologic reason to put ore between them. Passages that are supposed to run miles under multiple creeks in a region where known ore bodies are small and localized. Claims of carefully arched stone ceilings far out in the hills, with no evidence of any large-scale operation that could have afforded that work. These may still point to something: natural caves, small prospect holes, storm cellars, but the leap to extensive purpose-built underground highways isn't supported by what we know of the mining industry here. The tricky middle zone is where mining and memory overlap. A natural cave enlarged for ore, a short drift that broke into a karst system, a collapsed stope now exposed in a bluff, all can be read differently depending on who is looking. Miners saw tonnage, their grandchildren saw a spooky tunnel. Local storytellers later saw proof of a hidden network. That layered reading is part of why the Ozark underground remains so hard to categorize. Beneath the leaf litter and sinkholes lies a real documented web of human-made workings chased through lead and zinc. Around and between those workings lie natural caves and passages shaped by water over millions of years. And draped across both, there is the human tendency to connect dots, to turn isolated shafts and adits into lines on an invisible map. As we move into the era of war and lawlessness, that invisible map becomes even more attractive. If the hills truly are mined all through, then it becomes easy to imagine people using those same passages for other purposes entirely. By the time the Civil War reached the Ozarks, those hills full of mines and caves became something else: cover. The region was a patchwork of loyalties: Unionist families, Confederate sympathizers, enslaved people seeking freedom, guerrilla bands with shifting allegiances. The war here was not just armies on open fields. It was ambushes on back roads, raids on isolated farms, sudden disappearances into the timber. In that kind of conflict, any hole in the ground started to look useful. There is no serious doubt that caves and mine workings saw military use. Contemporary reports, letters, and diaries mention them, sometimes casually. A cave as a rendezvous point, a hole in the bluff where contraband salt or powder was hidden, a mine pressed into service as a shelter for refugees when a town changed hands. These are not the stuff of legend, they're just practical decisions in rough terrain. Caves provided concealment first of all. A small scouting party could camp in a dry room back from the entrance. Fire hidden, horses picketed under overhanging rock. The cool air and constant temperature made caves natural pantries. Salted meat, grain, gunpowder, and medical supplies could be cached away from prying eyes. In some accounts, local people talk about carrying sacks of flour or barrels of saltpeter into the cave above the creek before a raid came through. Sometimes the cave in those stories was probably a natural system. Sometimes it was a short adit, a coal prospect, or an abandoned lead drift with just enough space to stack crates and roll a barrel inside. The vocabulary in the records is often loose. A soldier from a flatter state might call any dark opening a cave. A miner might call the same opening a tunnel. A local farmer might just call it the old diggings. Evasion is another well-documented use. When cavalry raids hit a town, people fled into the woods, into ravines, sometimes underground. There are accounts of women and children sheltering in caves while fighting went on nearby, of Unionists hiding from Confederate conscription patrols, and of Confederate sympathizers hiding from Union scouts doing the same thing in reverse. A dark, narrow passage with a bend that cuts off light becomes a temporary world apart from the war. Wartime improvisations could also change the underground itself. A narrow natural opening could be widened with picks. A low ceiling could be cribbed up with timber. A muddy crawlway might get a stone sill to keep feet dry. In the moment, these are minor modifications, work a few men could do in an afternoon. A century and a half later, if all the wood has rotted and only the cut rock remains, that widened slot can look like a deliberately engineered tunnel mouth. This is where historical use and later memory start to blur. If a small rough adit was extended a short distance into softer rock to hide supplies, someone in 1863 would have still called it the mine. Someone in 1963 might remember being told there was a war tunnel that went back under the hill. Add another generation, subtract the specifics, and the story becomes, they had tunnels all through here during the war. Hidden arms caches are a recurring theme in local oral histories. Stories circulate about rifles, kegs of powder, even small artillery pieces supposedly rolled into caves and sealed up when a unit retreated or when the war ended. Occasionally, these tales line up with documented arms depots that were indeed concealed and later recovered. More often, the evidence is thinner: a note in a memoir about burying weapons in a safe place, an undated local story about guns in a cave, and a present-day shaft or sinkhole that could be almost anything. Escape routes and guerrilla passageways sit on an even hazier line between practicality and embellishment. Guerrilla bands in the Ozarks did use the landscape masterfully: ridges, hollows, creeks, and timber. They knew every ford and every shortcut. It would be surprising if they did not also use caves and mine workings when they were handy. A narrow ravine with a cave at its head makes an excellent last-ditch hideout. An adit that breaks into a natural cavity gives you a hidden chamber and a second way out if the roof fissures to the surface. But the step from "we hid in that cave" to "we had a tunnel that ran from the river to town" is large. Wartime records mention caves as landmarks and hideouts. They do not document extensive purpose-built underground highways for troop movement in the Ozarks. Large tunneling projects require time, engineering, and relative stability conditions in short supply during years of raids, burning, and forced marches. Local testimonies collected long after the war are valuable, but they have to be read with care. People remember the fact of fear and hiding vividly. The exact details of where and how can drift. A grandparent's story about a secret way out from a bluff cave may point to a small side fissure or a chimney that a wiry teenager once squeezed through. Later listeners, imagining soldiers marching in formation through the dark, unconsciously scale that passage up. Wartime official documents have their own limits. Officers had little reason to map or describe every cave. Their reports focus on roads, rivers, and towns. A cave used as a temporary magazine might be noted as "secure position in the hills," with no hint to modern readers that it was underground. When post-war county histories were written, authors sometimes folded vague wartime recollections into more dramatic set pieces, emphasizing daring escapes and secret caches. Conflict tends to amplify secrecy narratives. When neighbors end up on different sides, when people vanish in the night and bushwhackings leave bodies by the road, explanations gravitate toward the hidden and the clandestine. Underground spaces become symbolic shorthand for that hidden war. Caves stand in for secret meetings. Mines stand in for unspoken loyalties. Over time, those symbols harden into stories about literal tunnels under entire towns, used for everything from prisoner transfers to clandestine councils. What we can say with confidence is this: Civil War activity in the Ozarks absolutely intersected with the region's underground. Caves and mines were used for concealment, storage, and evasion. Some were modified, a little or a lot in the process. The exact extent of that modification is hard to reconstruct. The tendency of later generations to reinterpret any man-made underground space as a wartime tunnel is just as real as the wartime uses themselves. Between the sparse official records, the selective memories of participants, and the layered embellishments of local tradition, the war years left a complicated imprint on the subterranean landscape. After Appomattox, many of those same hills and hollows would acquire new underground reputations, this time not for soldiers and scouts, but for people who wanted to avoid revenue agents, sheriffs, and tax assessors. After the war, the uniforms changed, but the habit of slipping into the hills when trouble came did not. The Ozarks were poor, rural, and scattered. Roads washed out. Railroads came late. Cash was scarce. Law enforcement was thin. Into that landscape stepped moonshiners, small-time rustlers, traveling peddlers who also moved contraband, and, in local memory, the occasional famous outlaw who supposedly lay out in the next hollow over. Post-war and late 19th century stories are full of quiet evasions. A still tucked back in a box canyon. A smokehouse that supposedly had a trapdoor to a tunnel where liquor could be hustled out the back when the revenue man rode up the lane. A store in a county seat with a stone cellar that, according to local talk, connected to the caves under town, so you could get away if a posse formed too quickly. In a region where rock is close to the surface, you don't need much imagination to put these stories underground. A spring issues from a low cave mouth at the base of a bluff. A ravine ends in a high, dry alcove. A farmstead has an old root cellar half dug into a hill. When people are already using caves to keep milk cool and vegetables from freezing, it doesn't take a leap to imagine whiskey kegs stacked in the dark, ready to be rolled into some side passage if the law comes knocking. There were practical reasons caves and hollows became the default stage for covert trade. The country was literally folded. Ridges, sinkholes, rock shelters, narrow saddles between creek heads, they all break sight lines. A wagon can be heard before it is seen. A lookout boy on a limestone ledge can spot dust on the road a mile away. The cool, steady temperature of an underground room is good for liquor. The brush around a sinkhole hides hoofprints. Even without grand tunnels, the land itself helps you disappear. When people in those years spoke of tunnels, they were often describing something modest. A hand-dug passage from a house basement to the side of a hill, maybe 20 or 30 feet long. A short drift cut into soft shale behind a still, just far enough to move barrels out of sight. A natural crawlway enlarged a little with picks so that a man could squeeze through to a second entrance. These are the kinds of features that turn up in archaeological and speleological surveys. Short, rough cuts, no lining, no elaborate engineering. Later retellings stretch those distances. A cellar two-bank passage that was once under the street becomes, in memory, a tunnel system running all over town. A small worked opening joining two low rooms in a cave becomes a secret route where horses were supposedly led through the hill. The daily language of the time did not draw a firm line between tunnel, cave, and dugout. A few yards of handwork could earn the same dramatic label as an imagined mile-long corridor. Crime folklore is especially good at upgrading such spaces. An ordinary cellar with stone walls and a damp floor is mundane. Make it the place where moonshiners hid from federal agents, and every irregular stone becomes a clue. A shallow mine prospect, abandoned when the ore pinched out, is just a hole. Say bushwhackers or bandits once used it as a hideout, and the same hole becomes a den of danger and intrigue. Stories attach like lichen to rock, slowly, then firmly. Adding a well-known name accelerates the process. Across the Ozarks, you can find caves that locals call Jesse James Cave, Bellstar's Hideout, the Robber's Tunnel, whether or not any documentary evidence ties those figures to that spot. Newspapers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries sometimes encouraged this by publishing breathless accounts of haunts of the James Gang or bandit caves discovered by boys out exploring. The Outlaws moved through a wide region. So did the stories. For families and communities, linking a nearby cave to a famous outlaw gave an otherwise anonymous landscape a place in the wider national drama. It also made for good storytelling around the stove in winter, and later, good marketing. When auto tourists began to arrive in the early 20th century, the same caves and cellars gained a second life. A guide at a commercial cave might mention, very casually, that old-timers say whiskey was once run through a side passage, or that a notorious robber holed up here between jobs. Each tour, each pamphlet, each county history reprinted the tale, often without checking earlier versions. Details blurred, then hardened. A short passage in an 1880s account became a long tunnel by the 1920s. A note that someone hid out near the cave evolved into a confident statement that the gang used the caves and tunnels extensively. The repetition gave weight to stories that may have begun as guesses, jokes, or efforts to impress visitors. From the historian's perspective, there is no need to choose between absolute fabrication and fully mapped underground highways. Small, practical underground modifications almost certainly existed. People did dig from one cellar wall into a hillside, did widen crevices in cave walls to create hiding spots, did stash contraband in shafts and adits. At the same time, the grand branching secret routes of local memory often look, on inspection, like a handful of short passages, stitched together by imagination and retelling. The result is a layered mental map of the Ozarks, one part physical stone and clay, one part remembered risk and evasion, and one part story. Moonshiners, outlaws, and traveling tales all help turn modest underground spaces into legendary routes. Those legends, repeated to generations of residents and visitors, would feed directly into the wider belief that beneath the Ozarks lies not just a maze of natural caves, but a vast and deliberate web of hidden tunnels. If outlaws and moonshiners turned the Ozark underground into a stage for chase stories, treasure hunters turned it into a vault. Almost anywhere you go in the region, you are not far from a story about buried wealth. Hidden Spanish gold. A lost silver mine worked by mysterious strangers and then sealed. A cave said to hold iron chests, walled up behind stone that no one has managed to move since. These are not vague, misty legends. They come with details. A particular bluff, a certain creek bend, a date scratched into a rock, a cross cut into a tree, A strange set of symbols on a cliff face that someone insists is Spanish writing. In many versions, there is a map, a piece of oilcloth, a crumbling page from a Bible, a diagram passed down in a family, copied and recopied until the lines are more wish than record. The stories almost always include obstacles. A passage that was open in Granddad's time but has since collapsed. A narrow side tunnel that goes back 40 or 50 feet and ends in a rockfall that sounds hollow when you knock on it. A shaft filled with water so deep no one has ever touched bottom. Markers that only make sense if you already believe the treasure is there. 3 stones arranged in a triangle. A notch in the top of a bluff. An oddly square boulder that surely must be man-placed. Maps and markers are part of the appeal because they promise a code to be cracked. The narrative invites you into a puzzle. If you can just line up the rock with the old oak stump, follow the ravine to the third spring, and step off exactly 72 paces, you will find the hidden entrance. When the math does not quite work out, when the oak has died, the spring has shifted, the field has been fenced and plowed, the gap between map and ground is where imagination steps in. Most of these tales do not grow from blank ground. They migrate onto features that already exist. A known cave takes on an extra chamber that no one has quite found. An abandoned lead prospect, a short tunnel driven into the hillside until the ore ran out, becomes a lost silver mine in later telling. A root cellar dug into clay under a log house becomes, in grandchildren's memories, the top of a stairway once leading down to Spanish workings that were closed for safety. It makes sense. The Ozarks are full of holes, natural and man-made. You do not have to invent an entrance, only a reason why someone long ago would have chosen that particular one to hide something precious. A dark cave mouth already looks like a vault door. A mine shaft already leads to the underground. Treasure lore snaps onto these, like a latch. Economic hardship keeps the story alive, in a region where farms scraped by, where the price of timber or ore rose and fell with distant markets. The idea that there might be a cache of coins or bullion somewhere in the hills was more than entertainment. It was a quiet, recurring hope, a way out, a fantasy that did not have to admit it was a fantasy. People hunted for treasure on Sundays after church, on idle afternoons in winter, on days when the fields were too wet to plow. The timing of some of the richest lost mine stories is telling. They surge in periods of downturn and uncertainty, after the Civil War, during the long agricultural depressions of the late 19th century, in the 1930s. Newspapers from those eras carry little news items about old Spanish mines rediscovered, about men who claim to have seen ancient smelter slag in remote hollows, about coded directions found in a dead relative's trunk. Most fade after a few inches of print. The hope behind them does not. The motifs are not unique to the Ozarks. Across North America you find strikingly similar patterns. In the Southwest, legends of lost Spanish or Jesuit gold mines, maps carved on rocks, and sealed caverns full of church plate. In the Appalachians, tales of Loyalist or Confederate gold buried at the head of a hollow and marked with chiseled signs. In the Northern Plains, stories of fur traders' silver hidden along old canoe routes. The details change. The structure repeats. Foreign miners who knew a secret vein. Sudden disappearance or death before they could return. A handful of physical clues. A landscape that might, just might, still yield the hoard. In the Ozarks, the Spanish label often says more about later imagination than about actual colonial activity. Spaniards did have a legal claim to much of the region in the 18th century. They issued mining grants. They traded along the rivers. But the neat dramatic narrative of armored men working rich silver veins deep under remote hills, and then sealing them away with carved symbols comes mostly from 19th and 20th century retellings. The Spanish name lends age and romance to what might otherwise be a story about somebody's grandfather hiding hard silver coins in a cave during hard times. Treasure hunting shapes how people remember local history. On one side it preserves. A story about hidden gold under a certain bluff keeps that bluff, that hollow, that spring in community memory. Old land claims, tales of early settlers, faint rumors of French or Spanish travelers, all get repeated because they might be clues. People hold on to old documents, point out carvings, recall where fence lines and wagon roads once ran, because any of it might relate to the treasure. On the other side, it distorts. Once a cave or shaft is labeled as the place where the Spanish worked or the outlaw hid his loot, other explanations get pushed aside. A lead prospect dug in the 1880s to test a vein suddenly becomes proof of an earlier, richer mine. A carved initial that may be from a boy in 1910 becomes a Spanish mark if the story requires it. Temporal layers collapse. A bluff holds at once 18th century miners, Civil War bushwhackers, and a Depression-era hermit, all because the treasure narrative needs more weight. For historians and archaeologists, this double effect is a challenge. The stories bring attention to real sites. They also encourage digging, prying, and unrecorded disturbance in ways that strip away context. A stone wall that might have told one story when left intact becomes a pile of rubble, remembered only as a thwarted attempt to reach chests that were never found. Yet the persistence of lost mine and buried treasure narratives tells us something important about the Ozarks. People in a hard landscape have wrapped their desire for security and fortune around the most enduring thing they know, the rock itself. They have imagined the hills not just as obstacles to be farmed around or tunnels to be slipped through, but as banks holding deposits from some earlier, luckier time. Those imagined hoards and the maps and rumors that surround them would shape the way generations looked at caves, shafts, and tunnels under their feet. By the late 19th century, the tunnels under the Ozarks were not just in people's conversations. They were in print. Newspapers were the engines. Small-town weeklies with 4 cramped pages, regional dailies trying to keep readers with a mix of politics, farm prices, and whatever would make people talk at the barber shop. An unexplained hole in a hillside, a sink that opened overnight in a pasture, a rumor of a cave that runs for miles under town, those were ready-made curiosities. Editors understood something simple: ordinary events did not travel. Strange ones did. So when a farmer's mule fell through a thin crust of rock into a 10-foot cavity, the story might become, after a few retellings and a few edits, evidence of an underground passage of unknown extent. If a boy squeezed into a short side cave and came back claiming it went on farther than his courage, the paper might add, "There are those who believe this to be part of a long-forgotten tunnel." You see it in the language. Headlines that lean toward mystery: subterranean passage found near Mill Creek, ancient tunnel under Courthouse Hill. The body of the article usually walks things back. A cave entrance, a small room, a passage that seems to continue, though access is difficult, but the headline lodges in memory. Tunnel, ancient, secret. County histories work the same territory, but at a slower, more dignified pace. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, many Midwestern counties commissioned thick, subscription-funded volumes, biographies of leading citizens, lists of early office holders, chapters on geology and natural curiosities. Compilers went door to door gathering anecdotes. They read old newspaper files. They copied local lore that had already been polished by a generation of front porch telling. A single unexplained feature could grow every time it touched paper. The first mention, a small cave discovered in 1873, extends some distance under the bluff. 20 years later, in a county history, old residents recall a cave discovered in the early days, thought by some to be an artificial tunnel, purpose unknown. Another generation on, a brief column in a town centennial issue, tradition has it that a mysterious tunnel once ran under the bluff, used by outlaws and perhaps dug in Spanish times. Nothing new has happened underground. What has changed is the way the story is framed. Natural cavity becomes possible tunnel. Possible tunnel becomes near certainty. The phrase "tradition has it" does a lot of work. It signals hearsay but also dresses it up. It invites readers to accept the tale as part of the community's inheritance. Recycling was constant. A paragraph about an underground passage in one county history appears, almost word for word, in a neighboring county's volume a decade later, just with the place name swapped. A news item from 1895 about a cavern of great extent reappears in a 1920s feature column, trimmed and sharpened, now said to be a tunnel worked by early miners. The same 2 or 3 examples get cited again and again until they feel like a broad pattern rather than a handful of incidents. For historians, that echo chamber is a problem. When you trace a story about a tunnel back through the footnotes, you often find that all the roads lead to one short, vague paragraph written long after the fact. 100 later references do not equal 100 independent observations. They can be one uncertain event, multiplied through repetition. Verification is uneven. Some printed accounts point to sites you can still walk to. A cave under a specific bluff, a spring with a known name, a shaft recorded on early mining maps. When later writers describe tunnels in those places, it is at least possible to compare the story with a rock, with geological surveys, with mining records. Sometimes the tunnel turns out to be a short adit, a horizontal mine opening, driven in the 1880s. Sometimes it is a perfectly ordinary solution cave, one of thousands in the region, dressed up with speculation. Other accounts are almost impossible to pin down. An underground way near an old Indian mound. A tunnel said to run from the river bluff to the hill back of town. No coordinates. No names that survive. The landscape has changed, roads moved, creeks rerouted, houses built over old fields. In those cases, all that remains is language. A suggestion set into print once and then quoted, summarized, embroidered, until it becomes part of a regional sense that there are tunnels everywhere under these hills. Print culture turned local rumor into regional legend. A story that might once have stayed within a single valley could appear in a county paper, get picked up by a bigger town's weekly, be mentioned in a booster pamphlet or a travel column. Readers 2 or 3 counties away would see mysterious tunnel in the Ozarks and add that to their mental picture of the region, even if they could not point to the exact hill. Over time, this created a feedback loop. People expected the Ozarks to have secret tunnels because they had read about them. When they encountered any odd underground feature, they were ready to interpret it through that frame. A natural crack? A short man-made shaft? A cellar whose origin was forgotten? Any of these could be slotted into the existing idea, part of the hidden network. So the tunnels spread, not necessarily under the ground, but across columns and chapters, headlines and captions. Ink connected what rock did not, weaving a paper map of mystery that later generations would take as a starting point, and sometimes as evidence. When you move from stories to shovels, the picture does not necessarily get clearer. Archaeology seems, at first glance, like it should be the perfect tool for sorting out what really happened in the Ozark underground. Dig carefully, record everything, date the finds, and let the layers tell their story. In open-air sites, that method can work beautifully. On a bluff top or a river terrace, you might get a clean sequence. Early campfires at the bottom, later houses above, modern trash at the top. Caves and tunnels do not cooperate in the same way. Underground spaces in the Ozarks are often used, abandoned, reused, and disturbed over thousands of years. Animals move bones. Water washes in silt and washes it back out. Miners enlarge a natural fissure. A bootlegger in 1925 stashes jars in a niche that sheltered a torchbearer in 1825 and a hunter in 1525. Later, someone curious about Indian treasure digs a random pit in the floor, throwing aside whatever layering once existed. From that moment on, the archaeological record is scrambled. What archaeology can do, even in these damaged conditions, is show that people were there, and sometimes give hints about how they were using the space. Excavations and careful recording in Ozark caves have turned up a wide spectrum of material, stone tools and flakes from making them, fragments of fired clay vessels, charred plant remains from hearths, animal bones with cut marks, woven fiber remnants, pieces of leather, and in some cases, human burials. More recent layers add their own signatures. Glass bottles, rusted cans, nails, cartridge cases, broken lanterns, bits of clothing, horseshoe nails, tobacco tins, clay pipes. In a few places, items like buttons, harmonica reeds, and domestic ceramics show that people were not just passing through, but spending enough time to bring household objects underground. Each type of find suggests possibilities. A concentration of broken pots and cooking stones near a soot-blackened ceiling hints at short-term habitation, or repeated visits for tasks like food preparation or hunting. Carefully placed burials, sometimes accompanied by particular objects, point to ritual or funerary use. Caches of tools or stored food in side passages suggest storage, a way of keeping things cool or out of sight. But the key word is suggest. One ceramic sherd by itself does not prove a living room. A single musket ball does not prove a battle. Archaeologists rely on patterns. How many objects, of what kinds, in what exact positions relative to one another, and to the cave's natural features. In a pristine site, those patterns can be read with some confidence. in many Ozark caves and reported tunnels, that pristine condition is long gone. Looting has been a constant, quiet presence in the region's underground. For generations, locals and visitors alike have dug in cave floors looking for relics, minerals, or rumored treasure. Amateur collectors, sometimes acting with genuine curiosity and no sense of harm, have removed bones, pots, and tools without recording where they came from. Dynamite has been used to open up tight passages. Spoil piles from early mining or modern landscaping have dumped cave sediments far from where they formed. Every one of those actions destroys context. The object itself survives. It ends up in a shoebox, a curio cabinet, or a small museum, but the information about how it related to everything else is gone. A projectile point resting in undisturbed sediment alongside charcoal can be radiocarbon dated and tied to a specific period. The same point, dug out of a mixed hole and rescued from a looter's discard pile, loses most of that meaning. It proves that someone at some time carried a weapon or tool into the cave. It does not tell you whether that person lived there, hid there, or just stopped for an hour to get out of the rain. This is where the question of tunnels collides with the limits of underground archaeology. Suppose you find a 19th century bottle deep in a narrow passage. Does that mean there was once a continuous tunnel linking two distant points on the surface, used as a route of travel? Possibly. It could also mean that someone crawled in from a nearby entrance that has since collapsed, or that the bottle was washed there by floodwater. Without clear stratigraphy, without a mapped system of entrances and exits that can be dated, the bottle cannot by itself outline a network. Likewise, scattered artifacts along a cave passage can be interpreted in more than one way. A series of hearths and sleeping areas, with domestic debris, might indicate sustained occupation. A sparse trail of dropped items, a button here, a shoe sole there, might point to occasional passage. In practice, many Ozark sites fall somewhere in between, with enough human material to rule out pure accident, but not enough to define a single obvious function. When people hear that a cave has Indian artifacts, Civil War relics, or old Spanish tools, it is tempting to jump from that fact to a picture of organized tunnel systems, long corridors built for hidden travel, trade, or warfare. Artifacts can certainly support the idea that a particular underground space mattered to somebody. They seldom on their own prove how far that space extends or whether it was part of a larger, engineered design. And once a site has been heavily disturbed, the unanswered questions tend to stay unanswered. An early farmer might have pulled out a stone axe from a sinkhole and never written down exactly where. A group of teenagers in the 1950s might have explored a tight passage before it collapsed, bringing out Indian pottery whose original location is now unknowable. By the time a trained archaeologist arrives, what remains is fragments with stories attached, stories hard to verify against the rock itself. So archaeology gives us pieces, evidence of ancient visits, ritual deposits, practical uses, and more casual wanderings underground. It confirms that caves in the Ozarks have long been part of human life. At the same time, the very places most wrapped in tunnel lore are often the ones most disturbed, dug, and collected from, leaving a record that hints at connections in corridors but does not quite resolve them. The result is a kind of enduring twilight, enough material to know that something happened under these hills, not quite enough in many cases, to say exactly what or how far it went. If archaeology gives you scattered pieces, geology and cave science give you the walls and floors themselves. When an experienced caver or geologist steps into an underground passage in the Ozarks, they start sorting it into two broad categories in their head: what the water made and what people changed. Natural caves in this region tend to have a certain look. They follow the grain of the rock. Passages wander along joints and bedding planes, curving with the layers, dropping where the limestone has dissolved along a fracture, widening where softer rock gave way. Ceilings are often irregular, domes, solution pockets, scallops, the little spoon-shaped scoops on the walls that show the direction and strength of ancient water flow. Floors slope toward lower openings marked by channels, gravel bars, and silt deposits that line up with the way groundwater moves through the hill. Human excavation fights against that tendency to curve and wander. Engineered tunnels, when they really are engineered, usually show a taste for straight lines and right angles. Miners and tunnelers like to work on a consistent grade. They follow ore veins or survey lines, not meandering cracks. So one of the first clues experts look for is alignment. Does this passage run in a remarkably straight line for a long distance, ignoring obvious rock structures it cuts across? Does it maintain a nearly constant width and height, like a hallway, instead of swelling and shrinking with the vagaries of dissolution? On the walls, they look for tool marks. Chisels, picks, and drills leave patterns. Repeated blows with hand tools make parallel grooves and faceted surfaces that catch light differently than the smoother, pitted texture of dissolved rock. Drill holes for blasting are even clearer. Regularly spaced circular holes, often in rows, left from the days when black powder or dynamite was used to break the face. In some Ozark mines and short adits, you can still see these holes marching along the walls like a dotted line. Support structures are another giveaway. Natural caves do not grow square-cut timbers. If you see notches cut into bedrock for posts, rotting wood lagging still wedged against the ceiling, stacked stone pillars where no natural pillar should be, you are looking at human engineering. Even when the wood has long since decayed, scars where it pressed against the rock, or sockets carved to receive it, can linger as ghost architecture in the stone. Spoil patterns also matter. When people dig, they have to put the material somewhere. In a true tunnel project, the excavated rock, the muck or spoil, often forms piles near entrances or in side chambers. These piles have a sharp, blocky texture distinct from the rounded gravels left by streams. They might include a mix of rock types that do not match the natural layering of the cave, because workers were hauling out whatever they broke, not what water sorted over millennia. Experts watch how air and water behave too. Natural systems tend to breathe with temperature and pressure changes in predictable ways. A draft that lines up with known sinkholes and springs suggests a continuous cave system. But a dead-end passage with no consistent airflow, sharp corners, and an uphill climb away from any reasonable water route may be more likely to be a prospecting tunnel or a short-lived excavation. Likewise, a passage whose floor shows no signs of periodic flooding, even though it sits at a level where water should move during storms, might have been cut above the natural drainage, another sign of human choice. None of these clues on their own are perfect. Rock collapses. Ceilings fall off slabs that can make a once smooth wall look jagged and random. Over centuries, a carefully squared tunnel mouth can erode into a lumpy opening that blends into the bluff. Wooden supports rot away, leaving only stains and voids. In some places, water later invades a human-made passage, carving scallops on top of tool marks, mud-coating walls, or rounding off sharp corners. The result is a hybrid space that behaves partly like a cave and partly like a tunnel, confusing at first glance. Human modification runs in the other direction as well. People enlarge natural openings, chisel down overhangs, stack short walls to make ledges, or smooth a rough floor to roll barrels. Generations later, a visitor sees a short stone wall and a straight run of passage and assumes the whole thing is artificial, when in reality nature did most of the work and humans just customized it. This is where misidentification creeps in. A straight-looking stretch of cave, viewed in the beam of a single flashlight, can feel like a purpose-built corridor, even if on a detailed map, it gently curves with the bedding planes. A chamber where part of the wall broke away can leave a flattish surface that resembles a cut. Add a low-stacked stone shelf built by a hunter or a moonshiner, and the mind fills in the rest. This must be a constructed room, part of a larger system. Partial walls especially lend themselves to stories. A few courses of stones against a cave wall might be the remnant of a crude pen, a windbreak for sleepers, a platform for storing food off the damp floor. To someone arriving with tunnel tales already in mind, that same feature might look like the last visible trace of a more extensive masonry lining, proof of a lost underground highway whose other parts have collapsed. To sort through all this, different kinds of experts bring different tools. Cavers map. They crawl, climb, and measure, turning the underground into surveyed lines and cross-sections. Those maps can show whether mysterious straight passages are truly straight, whether alleged branch tunnels really connect across valleys, and how the system relates to surface features like sinkholes, springs, and ridges. Geologists read the rock. They identify formations, joints, and faults, Check whether a passage follows a natural structural trend, and examine surfaces under good light for microscopic evidence of dissolution versus percussion. They can tell you whether a flat wall is actually a bedding plane or a blasted face, whether that ceiling arch is a natural stress relief feature or one carved to keep rock from falling. Historians and archival researchers add a different layer. They look for mining records, property plats, company reports, WPA surveys, Civil War accounts, and local government documents that mention quarrying, tunnel projects, or underground construction. If a supposed ancient tunnel lines up perfectly with a documented 1880s lead prospect, that changes the story. If no records mention work where a carefully engineered passage appears, that leaves more room for earlier or informal activity, but still does not by itself solve it. Taken together, these approaches create a framework. When you hear, in the case studies that follow, about a rancher's stone-lined tunnel or a perfectly straight passage under town, you can ask, do the walls carry tool marks or watermarks? Are there spoil piles, supports, or drill holes? Does the alignment follow the rock or ignore it? Is there any paper trail of human work nearby? Or is this likely a natural cave, perhaps modified in spots, that later memory has turned into something grander and more deliberate than the rock itself reveals? In the Ozarks, many underground spaces sit in a gray zone between engineered and natural. Understanding how experts try to tell them apart helps you see why some tunnel stories hold up under scrutiny, why others soften into misread caves and enlarged chambers, and why, in a few stubborn cases, the line remains blurry enough to keep the mystery alive. So let's open the case files. Not because there is one master tunnel under the Ozarks that explains everything, but because there are lots of small specific places where stories have settled, like silt in an underground pool. Each one looks a little different when you shine a light on it. Start with an entire category that turns up almost everywhere in the region: courthouse tunnels. In more than one Ozark County seat, older residents will tell you that the brick or stone courthouse once had a tunnel leading to the jail, or to the river, or to an unknown safe place outside of town. The details change from county to county. Sometimes it's described as big enough for horses, sometimes as a narrow passage for prisoners or officials. What's documented in many towns is much smaller and more practical. 19th and early 20th century courthouses often had short, covered passages linking the main building to a separate jail, boiler room, or records vault. Architects' plans show service corridors, coal chutes, and storm drains. Sanborn fire insurance maps sometimes label underground conduit, or passage, connecting structures on a single block. A few counties have surviving blueprints showing exactly where these short tunnels ran. What remains mostly anecdotal are the claims that these features extended far beyond the block. People remember a childhood dare to climb through a low arch in a basement, or a door that used to open onto a bricked-up corridor. They talk about relatives on the county road crew who found something when digging utilities and were told to cover it back over. The written record tends to go quiet at that point. No extended tunnel projects appear in the minutes. No big contracts, no engineering reports. So you get a pattern: a real, documented bit of underground infrastructure, plus blocked entrances, missing or incomplete records, and living memory that stretches the corridor's reach a little farther every decade. A second recurring type is the cave to spring passage. Here, the claim is that a cave high on a hillside connects to a spring in the valley, sometimes miles away. The story might say that animals driven into the upper cave appeared days later at the spring, or that a local boy once floated a candle on a board down into the darkness and saw its light reappear at the water's source below. In a region made of dissolving limestone, the basic idea, a hidden conduit between sink and spring, is completely plausible. Hydrologists dye trace these systems all the time, injecting harmless colored dye into a sinking stream and watching it emerge at a spring. Many Ozark caves are in fact pieces of larger underground drainage networks. The uncertain part is the scale and the accessibility. Surveyed maps often show that the walkable passage pinches down into tight, water-filled conduits long before it reaches the spring. Human-sized tunnels exist, but the continuous secret hallway you can stroll through from bluff to valley is much rarer than the stories suggest. In most cases, what's documented is a cave here, a spring there, and a strong scientific suspicion of a connection, without a human navigable tunnel linking the two. Then there are the mine connectors, Lead, zinc, and barite mines pockmark parts of the Ozarks. Company records, state mine reports, and old plats showed dozens of shafts and adits radiating from a single camp. Miners did drive drifts between working faces. They sometimes punched air passages to nearby hollows. In a few camps, underground maps clearly show miles of workings. That is the documented layer. On top of it sit stories that those mine workings continue well beyond the mapped areas, linking whole communities, or that they intercepted much older masonry-lined tunnels running in perfectly straight lines under the hills. Former miners remember going a long way underground, which they did but within a defined ore body. Families recall being warned to stay away from a particular sinkhole because it goes into the old mine, and they sealed it up. Here again, the recurring features are partial access, blocked openings and gaps in the surviving paperwork. Smaller companies went bankrupt. Records were lost or never filed. When a later landowner uncovers a stone-framed hole in a pasture, they may have no easy way to know whether it was a short prospecting tunnel, part of a bigger mine, or an entrance to a natural cave that miners briefly used. Finally, there are the hidden chambers, the single rooms in caves or under buildings that get promoted, over time, into nodes of a larger unseen network. A church basement with an odd stone alcove, a farmhouse cellar with an extra offset room behind a strangely thick wall, a cave chamber with a low, squared-off opening now packed with rubble. These places are real enough, you can stand in them. Archaeologists and cavers have documented plenty of isolated side rooms and artificially enlarged pockets. The question is what they were for, and whether they led to anything beyond themselves. Sometimes there is clear evidence of use: carved steps, soot on the ceiling, stacked stone benches. Those point towards cellars, storm shelters, root storage, or hideouts. In other cases, the chamber may simply be a natural enlargement in the cave, used briefly by hunters or herders and then abandoned. Oral tradition can fill the blank space with whispers of secret societies, civil war councils, or earlier unnamed builders, especially when no written record explains why the room was dug or favored. Across all these categories, a spectrum emerges. At one end are very plausible, well-documented features: short utility tunnels under courthouses and hospitals, mine drifts between shafts, natural caves clearly feeding major springs. In the middle are places where the physical evidence is strong: blocked entrances, tool-marked walls, altered chambers, but the purpose and full extent remain undocumented. At the far end are stories of vast, straight-running, stone-lined passages that ignore the logic of the rock and leave almost nothing to touch or measure. The recurring patterns are hard to miss: blocked or buried openings that no one now wants to dig out. Local witnesses who are sure of what they saw as children decades ago. Gaps in county files where a sensible project would have left paperwork. A tendency for modest, practical structures to grow longer, older, and more mysterious in the telling. Some of these case files likely reduce, on close inspection, to short, human-made tunnels doing ordinary work, carrying steam pipes, coal, or prisoners across a courtyard. Others rest on real but difficult-to-access cavern systems that water, not people designed. And a few stubborn stories still sit in the gray zone, where the rock, the records, and the memories do not quite line up, leaving a pocket of unresolved space under the hills. By the mid-20th century, those gray zones under the hills met a new kind of worry. Older stories about outlaw hideouts and courthouse passages didn't disappear. They picked up fresh layers about Washington, about missiles, about the next war that everyone hoped would never come. People in the Ozarks started saying that some of those blocked doors and squared-off openings weren't just old utility corridors or mine drifts. They were government tunnels, civil defense routes, secret storage for something important, or dangerous, or both. There were reasons that sounded believable at the time. The Cold War put the underground on people's minds in a very literal way. Cities across the country held duck and cover drills. Newspapers ran diagrams of fallout shelters. Civil defense pamphlets talked about basements, caves, and tunnels as possible refuges from nuclear blast and radiation. Highway departments planned how to move traffic away from targets. Governments at every level quietly asked themselves what would happen if the worst day came. In that atmosphere, a region full of caves and mines looked like ready-made infrastructure. Local rumors say that certain caves were quietly surveyed by federal officials, that old mines were inspected as possible storage, that a particular hilltop with odd vents was really an entrance to a hardened bunker. People remember unmarked trucks at night, or men with clipboards who weren't from here asking about sinkholes and springs. A few families tell of being turned away from a familiar cave by someone in uniform doing testing. What can be documented looks more prosaic. Civil defense records from the 1950s and 60s show state and county officials in the Ozarks drawing up shelter inventories. They counted basements in public buildings, checked school gymnasiums, and noted caves that might hold people in an emergency. Some counties bought supplies. A few installed signage. There were regional plans for where officials would go if major cities were hit. Nearby military bases hardened parts of their own facilities and built secure communication lines. Those were real projects. They left paperwork, budgets, and occasionally surviving structures, reinforced rooms in courthouses, stout concrete basements labeled as fallout shelters, short tunnels between hospital wings meant to move patients and equipment undercover. The leap from that to a vast, secret network under the Ozarks is where the evidence thins out. Stories about underground government installations in the region often rely on the same kinds of details that surround older tunnel legends: a locked door in a bluff, a graded road to nowhere, a fenced area on private land with antennas and no public explanation. Sometimes there really is a known facility there, but one that is much smaller and more specialized than the rumor imagines: an emergency communication tower, a weather radar site, a simple storage bunker for highway materials. Other times, property is simply inaccessible. A corporation buys up land around a cave. A federal agency manages a tract for conservation and posts it. Locals who grew up exploring a particular hollow now find a gate and a no trespassing sign. The story flows in to fill the gap. If we can't go there anymore, there must be something inside. Real secrecy in certain programs gave these ideas extra weight. During the Cold War, governments did operate facilities that the public knew little or nothing about at the time. Continuity of government bunkers far from the Ozarks, secure communication centers built into hillsides, ammunition depots screened by trees. Declassified plans and later reporting have shown that some mountain and plateau regions really do contain elaborate underground complexes. Once you know those exist somewhere, it becomes easier to imagine them anywhere. Historians looking at Ozark tunnel stories have to work within that mixed landscape. Proven examples of hidden infrastructure in some places, and only hearsay in others. When a claim rests entirely on, my grandfather told me, and the site is now under a subdivision, a reservoir, or a locked gate, there is not much to test. When a story points to a present-day installation with restricted access, researchers may be legally barred from confirming or denying what lies beneath. That doesn't mean the stories are false. It also doesn't make them true. It just means the evidence stops at the fence line. So historians tend to separate these threads. They acknowledge the broader context, civil defense planning that really did treat caves and basements as potential shelters, military logistics that did seek remote areas for storage and training, and an era when governments considered the underground a strategic asset. They can point to specific, documented bunkers and short tunnels that fit within that pattern. At the same time, they are cautious about extending that pattern into a seamless, unseen network under the Ozarks without maps, engineering records, or physical surveys to support it. What seems clear is that 20th century fears and policies did not replace older tunnel lore. They fused with it. The same cave that once hosted a story about Civil War guerrillas might, in a later generation, become the rumored site of a nuclear command post. The same bricked-up courthouse corridor that used to lead, in memory, to a river escape route, might now be said to connect to a hidden emergency shelter dug in the 1960s. A blocked mine adit that older miners swore just led to another stope becomes, in a grandson's telling, the entrance to a Cold War cache. Layer by layer, the underground gathers new explanations that fit each era's anxieties. Outlaws and bushwhackers in the 19th century. Secret societies and bootleggers in the early 20th. Civil defense planners and mysterious agencies in the Cold War. In the present, stories about data centers, underground highways, or undisclosed storage sites added on top. The rock itself doesn't change. The rooms and passages are what they are, natural voids, mine workings, short utility tunnels, sealed off chambers. What shifts is the story we tell about who might be in them, and why no one will show us the map. For people who like clean answers, the Ozark tunnels are a bad fit. Historians walking into this subject run into practical walls almost immediately. A lot of the places mentioned in older stories simply no longer exist in a form that can be checked. Hillsides were blasted for highways. Town squares were rebuilt. Mines collapsed or were intentionally sealed. Whole hollows disappeared under reservoirs. You can't open a locked door in a bluff if the bluff itself is gone. Records are just as patchy. County courthouses burned. Private company archives were thrown out when a mine closed or a railroad folded. Family papers sat in damp boxes until they molded. When someone 50 years ago wrote "tunnel under the square" in a local column, they rarely drew a map or gave measurements. They assumed everyone reading already knew what they meant. On top of that, much of the relevant underground is on private land. A researcher might know that 3 separate families have sworn there's a stone-lined passage somewhere on a particular farm. But if the current owner doesn't want strangers digging, or if liability concerns make them nervous about letting people into old workings, the investigation stops at a polite no. Cavers and local historians encounter the same thing. Stories abound. Access does not. Then there's the quiet erosion of local knowledge. The person who actually crawled through a particular opening, or who remembered when the cellar of one building truly did connect to another, may be gone. Their children and grandchildren inherit fragments. Grandpa said you could go from the store to the river without going outside. Over time, small gaps in those memories get stitched together with guesses and borrowed details from other stories. That is where oral history becomes both vital and difficult. Spoken accounts preserve things that were never written down. Nicknames for caves, the location of a forgotten adit, the fact that a certain basement flooded whenever the creek rose. They can point historians toward places the official records never mention. When 3 unrelated families, in different decades, all describe a passage behind the same church, that repetition matters. But oral history also reshapes itself as it moves through time. The basic skeleton of a story might stay constant. There's a tunnel from here to there, while everything around it changes. Who built it, why they used it, what was once stored inside, all of that can be updated to match new fears and fascinations. A route once said to be for moving ice in summer becomes, later, a prohibition tunnel. Then, later still, a Cold War passage to a secret shelter. Historians have to treat those layers carefully. They compare what people say with what geology allows. They look at whether a supposed route would cut across a resistant ridge under a major river or through rock types that don't hold stable voids. They check whether archaeologists have found any signs of long-term human modification nearby. Tool marks, stacked stone, artifacts and sediment. The overlap between these fields is uneven. Geologists can say, this hill could easily contain a small cave, or a long straight tunnel here would be very hard to keep from collapsing. Archaeologists can say, we've found worked stone and deposits that show repeated use of this entrance. Folklorists can show that similar stories appear in dozens of communities that never shared an actual structure. Documentary historians can point to maps, deeds, mining reports, or city plans that hint at specific underground works. Rarely do all 4 lines of evidence line up neatly, so historians often end up confirming something more modest than the popular legend. They can say, yes, people clearly used this cellar network in the 19th century. Yes, there was a short utility tunnel between these buildings. Yes, caves in this valley were used as hideouts or storage, and some entrances were later blocked. They can even say that in a mining district, it's entirely plausible that multiple shafts and drifts connected below ground. What they usually cannot say, with the evidence in front of them, is that all of these pieces form one vast, continuous system under the region. The pressure to do that comes from outside the archive. People like single explanations. One builder, one moment in time, one hidden purpose that ties every rumor together. The idea that dozens of different tunnels, cellars, mine workings, spring caves, and culverts might exist side by side, built for different reasons in different centuries, feels unsatisfying. It doesn't make for a simple map, but often that patchwork is what the evidence actually supports. A 19th century brewery cave beneath a town, a short brick tunnel to move patients between hospital buildings, a Civil War rifle pit enlarged into a shelter, a lead mine with multiple levels and a few crosscuts that let workers move between shafts, a natural cave with a low crawl that happens to emerge near an old church. Each one spawns stories. The stories drift, merge, and sometimes land on the same phrase, the tunnels under the Ozarks. From a historian's perspective, the mystery endures partly because no single explanation cancels the others out. Some passages are almost certainly natural caves adapted by humans. Some are straightforward man-made utility tunnels. Some are remnants of mining districts. Some are probably nothing more than drainage culverts and sewer lines that felt bigger and more mysterious when remembered from childhood. And some, behind posted fences and sealed doors, remain unknown. Multiple possibilities can be true at once, in different places, even in the same town block. As long as records remain incomplete, entrances stay sealed, and memories keep blending, the picture will resist being flattened into one simple answer. The underground here is real stone and workspaces, but it is also a mosaic of uses and stories that don't line up into a single tidy diagram. Historians can map parts of it, they can test pieces. They can say where the ground is solid and where it gives way. What they cannot yet do is close the file with a definitive final word on the tunnels, as if there were only one thing hiding in the dark. Today, the people who chase these stories look very different from the characters who appear in them. Instead of outlaws, guerrillas, or nameless engineers, you mostly have cavers in worn coveralls, amateur genealogists with scanners, landowners with a stack of old deeds, and small-town history groups meeting in library basements. Each group brings a different piece of the puzzle. Cavers start with the rock itself. They move slowly, not chasing legends, but following airflow, water traces, and the smallest hint of a crack in a bluff. They kneel at sinkholes and feel for drafts with the back of their hands. When they find an opening, they don't just crawl in and start exploring. They survey. Modern cave surveys in the Ozarks are meticulous. Tape measures, laser rangefinders, compasses, inclinometers. Point by point, they map the shape of a passage. Distances, angles, heights. Every bend gets a station number. Every side lead is noted. Over hundreds of feet or miles, this turns into a detailed plan that shows where natural voids run under the surface. Those maps are then compared with the world above, roads, building foundations, old mine symbols on historic plats. A legend might say, tunnel from courthouse to river. A cave map might show a low, winding passage that passes behind the hill where the courthouse sits, then trends toward the floodplain. That's not proof that anyone ever connected the two, but it shows where nature provided a ready-made route. While cavers are tracing voids underground, archival researchers trace lines of ink. They comb through sand-borne fire insurance maps looking for small, easily overlooked labels. Subway, coal chute, vault, underground passage. They read minutes from town councils debating whether to build a drainage tunnel under Main Street. They check mining inspector reports that sometimes describe crosscuts and drifts that never made it onto public maps. Local history groups and historical societies take on a different layer. They organize oral history days, inviting older residents to tell stories on tape. They bring in old-school yearbooks and ask people to point out where the old tunnel used to be. They host talks where someone remembers crawling out of a storm drain as a child and being told never to go back, and someone else remembers hearing about an ice house that had a passage cut into a hillside. Those interviews don't settle arguments, but they give leads. If three people who never met each other all say that, in the 1950s, there was a stone arch opening behind the same building, that is something a researcher can pair with maps and photos. A blurry snapshot taken at a picnic might, once scanned and enlarged, show a dark, bricked-up recess in the background everyone used to ignore. On top of this human work, there are new tools that never existed when many of the stories were first told. Non-invasive mapping technologies like ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity surveys, and in some cases, LiDAR, let researchers look under the surface without digging. A radar unit rolled across a town square can detect anomalies, a zone where the signal bounces back in a way that suggests a void, a former basement, or a culvert. Resistivity lines strung across a hillside can show where rock gives way to empty spaces or fill. These methods come with limits. They're expensive, they require trained operators, and they don't give high-definition images. An anomaly might be a tunnel. It might also be a collapsed cistern, a tree root channel, or a jumble of loose rock. But they can tell a town that something is there, which is often more than anyone knew before. Access, however, remains the constant bottleneck. Many likely locations are under active businesses, private homes, or fenced pastures. Even when an owner is curious, lawyers and insurance companies are not. Letting a volunteer caver crawl into a 100-year-old storm drain under your property feels risky. If someone is injured, or a collapse is triggered, responsibility can be unclear. So doors stay locked, hatches stay bolted, and some of the most promising leads remain theoretical. Preservation ethics add another layer. Modern cavers and archaeologists are, in general, cautious. They know that one careless group can ruin a fragile site. A crawlway widened with a shovel might destroy older sediments that held artifacts. Graffiti over smoke marks might erase evidence of 19th century use. Removing a stacked stone wall to see what's behind it might collapse a structure that survived for generations. Responsible investigators follow a simple rule. Observe first, document, disturb as little as possible. They take measurements, photos, and notes. If they find historic bottles, tools, or carved initials, they record them in place instead of carrying them out as souvenirs. If a site seems archaeologically significant, they contact professionals instead of digging deeper on their own. Despite that caution, modern work has reshaped more than a few local legends. The same methods that sometimes support parts of a story also debunk others. A courthouse that supposedly sat above a 4-foot-high brick tunnel was scanned and later inspected. The only underground space was a shallow utility trench installed in the 1920s. A secret slave tunnel, romantically described in a brochure, turned out, on examination, to be a Prohibition-era drain leading from a former speakeasy to a nearby creek. The bricks, mortar, and layers of trash dated it neatly to the early 20th century, not the mid-19th. But there are also cases where investigation reveals a partial truth. A church said to have a tunnel to the river did, in fact, have a stone-lined passage from the basement out to a small spring cave 30 yards away. It was low, cramped, and clearly designed as a cool storage corridor, not an escape route. Over time, the detail about barrels of apples and crocks of butter vanished, and what remained was a tunnel from the church to the water. In another town, cavers following a small karst window under a bluff discovered that at some point, someone had enlarged a natural bedding plane with tools, stacked stones to shore up the roof, and punched out a small man-made side room. It didn't match any known mine, and there were no artifacts to date it precisely. It was neither the grand hallway of local rumor nor purely untouched cave. It sat in between, a quiet, ambiguous confirmation that people had indeed worked underground here in ways never recorded on paper. Modern technology has also changed how rumors spread. Online forums, social media groups, and digital archives bring together people who, a generation ago, would never have compared notes. Someone posts a question, "Anyone heard about a tunnel under the old hotel in X?" And within hours, responses arrive from former employees, a caver who surveyed a nearby spring, a librarian who uploads a scanned postcard showing a ventilation shaft that used to stand out back. Old newspaper clippings, once locked in a local drawer, can be digitized and shared widely. A casual line from 1898 about work progressing on the new sewer tunnel to the creek can now be read by hundreds of people, some of whom might recognize the same line in a family story. That broad circulation sometimes breathes new life into weak claims, but it also allows skeptical voices and detailed documentation to reach the same audience. Through all of this, a line emerges between responsible research and destructive curiosity. On one side are people who respect property lines, get permission, work with local experts, document what they see, and leave places as intact as possible. They accept that some questions will remain unanswered because the cost of answering them, risking collapse, damaging heritage, or violating trust is too high. On the other side are trespasses, unreported digs, and late-night explorations that pry open old seals and leave trash and broken formations behind. Those actions not only erase evidence, they often shut down future, More careful studies when landowners decide that any attention is too much. In the present-day Ozarks, the search for tunnels is less about bold discoveries and more about slow, layered work. Cavers trace voids, historians trace paper, families trace memories, and, occasionally, instruments trace faint signals under a town square. Some stories shrink under that attention. Some gain new, modest support. Many remain suspended between rock and rumor, waiting for the next careful person to listen, to look, and to decide, once again, how far it is wise to go. For most communities in the Ozarks, though, the tunnels are not a research question. They're a story. Over the 20th century, caves and rumored passages went from being hazards in pastures and damp places to store food, to being part of how towns described themselves to outsiders. If you look at local slogans, brochures, and Chamber of Commerce blurbs, you start seeing the same words over and over. Underground, hidden, mystery, secret. A town might have one show cave and 3 unverified tunnel tales, and all of them get woven together into a single underground identity. You see it in the way tour guides talk. A commercial cave with a perfectly ordinary side passage suddenly acquires a name like Outlaw Tunnel or Civil War Escape Route, even if no document ever tied that particular corridor to Jesse James or to a specific skirmish. A natural choke point carved by water becomes the place where they blocked the entrance during the war. The guide may admit, if asked directly, that the evidence is thin. But in the rhythm of the tour, it's presented as a smooth, satisfying part of the narrative. Roadside culture amplified this. Postcards showed yawning cave mouths with captions about mysterious tunnels under the Ozarks. Gas stations sold souvenir booklets that mentioned hidden passages under courthouses and churches without citing anything beyond local tradition. Highway billboards promised, "See the secret passages used by," followed by whichever group best matched the mood of the era: Native Americans, Confederate soldiers, moonshiners, gangsters. Each retelling shaved off the uncertainty. Instead of "Some say there was once a tunnel," it became, "This tunnel was used by," even in places where, on the ground, there is nothing more than a low crawl, a drain, or a collapsed cellar. Ambiguity doesn't fit neatly on a postcard. A question mark doesn't sell tickets as easily as a confident sentence. At the same time, local people weren't just inventing stories for tourists. They were also using these legends for themselves. A small town that has lost its railroad, its factory, and half its population still has something unique if it has the old tunnel nobody can explain. A family that never owned much land can still tell a story that their great-grandfather helped dig a secret passage to move contraband or aid fugitives. In that way, the underground becomes a shared inheritance. Communities sometimes protect these legends not because they believe every detail, but because the stories feel like part of who they are. Telling and retelling them at festivals, school history nights, or on the front porch connects generations. The fact that no historian has yet found a blueprint of a particular tunnel doesn't make the story worthless. It just pushes it into a different category. Not verified infrastructure, but living folklore. And folklore, even when it diverges from the archaeological record, often tracks real concerns. Stories about slave tunnels under houses that were never large plantations can still reflect unresolved feelings about slavery, race, and responsibility. Tales of outlaw hideouts tie into local unease about law, authority, and the line between admired independence and feared violence. Modern rumors about government bunkers and secret Cold War passages under dams echo anxieties about surveillance, militarization, and decisions made far away in Washington. In that sense, the tunnels become mirrors. Whether they are real, misremembered, or entirely imagined, the details chosen for the story reveal what people are worried about and what they hope is true. Hidden treasure legends express a desire for sudden reversal of fortune. Rescue and escape stories express a hope that, in a crisis, someone had a plan. Commercial retellings tend to flatten all of this. A showcase brochure will rarely linger on uncertainty or conflicting versions. It selects the most dramatic strand: Jesse James slept here. Union prisoners escaped through this passage. Ancient people carved this secret way, and repeats it until it feels inevitable. Over time, the neat version printed on tickets and narrated on loudspeakers can even feed back into local memory, replacing older, more tentative accounts. Historical method works in the opposite direction. Instead of starting with the most marketable storyline and treating it as fact, historians and archaeologists start with a mess: contradictory testimonies, incomplete maps, physical traces that might mean several things. They label gaps as gaps. They keep multiple possibilities on the table. They resist the urge to turn every dark hole into a defined tunnel to somewhere. For a sleepy listener, there's a quiet tension here. On one side, the comfort of a good story that explains everything under your feet in clear, satisfying terms. On the other, the slower, more patient acceptance that some things might remain partly unknown, and that this, too, can be part of a place's identity. In the Ozarks, the commercial life of the tunnel mystery hasn't simply smothered the past. It has also kept people curious. Signs by the highway, tall tales on tours, and glossy postcards have nudged generations to look at hillsides and creek banks and wonder what's inside. That curiosity, even when wrapped in exaggeration, is one of the reasons cavers, archivists, and careful listeners are still out there today, separating the rock from the rumor and the rumor from the wish. And once you start peeling those layers apart, you arrive at the harder question. If the stories won't entirely go away, even when evidence is thin, what does that say about what people really need from the idea of tunnels in the first place? If you lay all the stories out on the table and compare them to what we can actually see in the rock, in the records, and in old habits of living, a pattern does start to form. It is not a single hidden civilization or one master network under the whole plateau. It looks more like layers. At the base layer, there is the bedrock itself. In the Ozarks, water has been carving passageways for millions of years. Caves, sinkholes, swallow holes, underground streams. Long, sinuous galleries. Short, tight crawls. Vertical pits that feel like shafts. These are not rare exceptions. They are the background condition. If you grow up in that landscape, it is not hard to imagine that any unexplained dip in a yard, any cold draft from a crack in a bluff, any cellar where your voice echoes oddly, might connect to something larger. The natural system gives tunnel stories an endless supply of raw material. On top of that, you get the human-made voids, mine adits driven into hillsides for lead, zinc, iron, or building stone. Short drifts to chase a narrow ore body. Shafts sunk and later abandoned. Hand-dug wells that pulled double duty as cool storage. Limestone blocks taken out from under a town square, leaving a low, rough chamber that nobody bothered to fill perfectly when the job was done. These are the places where historians and geologists tend to agree most easily with local tradition. If there was a documented mine, there was a hole. If there was a courthouse with a thick stone foundation built in the late 19th century, it probably had some kind of basement or undercroft. If the town sat on karst, those basements and mine cuts often intersected small natural cavities. This is where the most plausible tunnel stories live. Short connecting corridors between a main building and a springhouse. A narrow passage linking a brewery to its ice caves. Storage rooms dug into the same bluff under multiple houses. Adits a few hundred feet long that, decades later, someone remembers as the tunnel we used to walk through from one end of the hill to the other. Add another layer, wartime improvisation. During the Civil War, people in the Ozarks used what they had. If there was a cave near a farm, it might shelter food or livestock from raiding parties. If there was a mine or cellar under a town, it might serve as a temporary hiding place. Guerrilla warfare, contested loyalties, sudden raids, all of that created real incentives to know the back ways and the dark corners. Here, the pattern in the records is weaker. We have scattered letters, a few official reports, some pension claims, local recollections written down decades later. They do not map out neat underground rail lines, but they make it reasonable to think that some of the most modest war-related tunnel tales. My great-grandmother hid in a cave during the raid. They slipped out the back through the cellar and into the rocks, fit common patterns of behavior, even if every doorway and distance cannot be proven. Then there is the layer of illicit work. Moonshining, smuggling, hiding contraband. Again, we have strong general evidence and weaker site-specific proof. Law enforcement records from the Prohibition era and the late 19th century mention stills in caves, caches in sinkholes, even the occasional underground room. Local histories from mining districts talk about stolen ore hidden away. Stories from border counties mention paths across ridges and through hollows used to avoid official roads. What we almost never have are blueprints of elaborate engineered passageways built just for crime. Blasting a proper tunnel through Ozark limestone, with ventilation, drainage, and support, was expensive. Using a convenient cave, an abandoned drift, or a cellar that already existed was not. So the most reasonable reading is that many outlaw and moonshiner stories are anchored in real use of natural and semi-natural spaces, not in vast man-made corridors. On top of all these layers, folklore does what folklore always does. It stitches things together. A mine adit and a cave entrance become two ends of the same secret tunnel. A cellar that opens onto a small karst cavity becomes an escape route all the way to the river. A spot where teenagers dared each other to squeeze through a tight crack becomes, in an older neighbor's version, where the soldiers disappeared underground. Over time, repetition sands down the rough edges. Uncertainty drains away. Tunnels lengthen in the telling. When you compare categories of claims against the available evidence, some stand up better than others. Most plausible, short, practical spaces tied to known needs. Storage cut into hillsides near springs. Basements and undercrofts under public buildings, mine workings within documented districts, caves and adits used incidentally in war or by people moving goods off the main roads. These fit what we know of local geology, technology, and habit. Less secure but still possible, medium-length connections between closely spaced structures on the same slope, especially where maps show old foundations or quarries now gone. A passage under a street between opposite-facing cellars. A shortcut from a church to a nearby bluff cave. These often lack direct documentation, but they do not require impossible effort. Weakest, claims of continent-spanning tunnels, ancient engineered grids unknown to archaeology, or perfectly finished secret corridors under every major Ozark town, all attributed to vague earlier peoples, with no artifacts, no construction debris, and no mention in the more detailed local records. Many of these legends rest almost entirely on repetition. They are told because they have been told before, not because someone found verifiable stonework linking two distant valleys. Separating these categories does not mean declaring every unproven story false. It just means being careful about what we treat as infrastructure and what we treat as imagination. A story that lacks physical or documentary support can still reveal how people see their past, what dangers they believe once stalked their streets, what hidden helpers they hope were at work. The enduring mystery, then, is not a single unsolved engineering feat. It is the way rock, risk, memory, and desire keep interacting under the same hills. Natural caves, dug spaces, wartime use, illicit activity, and story all blur together until, from the surface, it feels like there must be one grand answer beneath your feet. There probably isn't. There are, instead, many small overlapping answers. Some we can document, some we can only infer, and some that may never be pinned down. And that, in its own quiet way, leads to a different kind of question, not about what is literally under the Ozarks, but about what the idea of hidden tunnels has been carrying for people all along. When you listen closely to the tunnel stories, what they reveal most clearly is not the tunnels. They reveal the people who keep telling them. In the Ozarks, memory sits close to the ground. Family stories are attached to springs, to particular bends and creeks, to one ledge on one ridge. The landscape is not a backdrop, it is an active partner in the way people remember. A sinkhole is not just a geological feature, it is where a wagon tipped, where a cow vanished, where someone's uncle claimed he heard voices echoing up from below. A cave mouth is not just an opening. It is where corn was once hidden, where a child wandered too far and gave everyone a scare, where a neighbor says his grandfather met men by lantern light and didn't ask questions. Tunnel legends grow easily in a place like that because the land encourages you to think downward, to imagine depth. The ground is full of holes. The hills are hollow in ways you can feel in the wind and in the temperature of the rocks. If you live in a flat country, secrecy tends to be horizontal. People talk about back roads, about the stand of trees no one can see into, about the long way around. In the Ozarks, secrecy has a vertical dimension. It is under your feet. That is one thing the mystery reveals. A culture shaped by a landscape where retreat, storage, and survival have always had room to move into the dark. The stories also echo the region's long history of making do with what is at hand. Frontier families adapted to thin soil and broken ground by tucking gardens into pockets of bottomland, by building cabins on narrow benches, by learning which caves held steady cold for storing milk or meat. Miners adapted by driving short drifts where ore veins allowed, by learning how water moved through the stone, by using abandoned workings as convenient hiding places, cool rooms, or shortcuts. Guerrillas and soldiers adapted by mapping every fold of the terrain, knowing which ravines led to which springs, which rock shelters could hide a small group for a night. Moonshiners adapted by setting up stills in the next draw over, just out of sight, by using naturally quiet hollows where the sound of boiling mash would not carry far. When you add a tunnel to a story in that setting, it is rarely just decoration. It is a way of saying someone understood this place well enough to survive in it. Someone knew the rocks better than the outsiders did. The underground mystery, then, is tied tightly to themes of belonging and identity. A town that tells and retells its tunnel legends is, in a quiet way, insisting that there is more to it than what a visitor can see from the highway. That behind the visible storefronts and church steeples lie deeper connections, literal or not, between families, between eras, between crises. The tales about hidden passages for escaping raiders, for evading revenue agents, for slipping enslaved people or deserters past patrols, all have a similar emotional structure. They cast the hill people as small, sometimes poor, sometimes overlooked, but never passive. They present the Ozarks as a place where those on the margins could outthink or outlast the forces pressing in on them, partly because the land itself offered cover. Conflict, extraction, and adaptation all meet underground. The same hills that held ore for outside companies also held caves where locals stored their own food. The same rough country that hosted guerrilla bands and brutal raids also offered cracks and caverns where families and livestock could wait out the danger. That tension between vulnerability and resourcefulness is written into the tunnel stories. They are not just about mystery, they are about survival with limited power and limited means, under pressure from distant decisions, land policies, mineral leases, war orders, prohibition laws. Some landscapes lend themselves easily to this kind of layered legend. Karst regions, places with lots of caves and sinkholes, almost invite it. Appalachia has its coal mine myths and its cave stories. Parts of Central Europe do too. Anywhere people live on top of stone that is visibly dissolving and collapsing, tales of what might connect to what below the surface come almost automatically. The Ozarks add a particular mix, a long frontier period with scattered records, a mining history that literally hollowed out hills, a civil war fought in part as local guerrilla struggle, and an economy where informal and illicit work often blurred with formal labor. When records are patchy, when work moves in and out of legality, when geography hides as much as it reveals, you get room for many small truths to drift together into one larger hazy picture. That is what you see in the tunnel lore. Bits of authentic mining, real caves, documented wartime hiding, remembered moonshining, half-forgotten cellars, all fused into a single idea of the tunnels under town. If there is a lesson, it is not that there is one secret answer waiting to be excavated. It is that the most compelling explanation is a mosaic. Hundreds of small voids, many uses over many decades, many stories layered on top. Some pieces fit neatly with photographs, maps, and survey notes. Some sit next to them, plausible but unproven. Some float free, with no way now to either confirm or deny. Accepting that mosaic means accepting a measured kind of uncertainty. It means recognizing that historians, cavers, and locals can stand together at the same sinkhole or cellar door, each bringing part of the picture, none holding all of it. The unresolved nature of the Ozark tunnel stories is not a failure of explanation. It is an honest reflection of how history, rock, and memory actually work in such a place. Not every gap can be filled. Not every passage can be traced from end to end. What remains is a quiet awareness that beneath the plateaus and hollows lies a complicated record of adaptation and imagination, partly mapped, partly guessed at, partly lost. And the mystery that lingers is less a riddle to be solved than a reminder that some landscapes will always keep a portion of their story in the dark. When you pull back and look at the whole pattern, the Ozark Tunnel mystery sits at the crossing point of several long stories. There is the geology, a karst plateau riddled with caves, fissures, and disappearing streams. A landscape where stone is constantly opening and collapsing, where the ground itself invites the idea that something could be moving just out of sight. There is the deep human timeline. Indigenous nations using caves as sacred spaces, burial places, and seasonal shelters. Their presence recorded in artifacts and art, but thinly in text, leaving stretches of meaning that modern researchers can see the edges of, without being able to fully reconstruct. There is settlement, scattered cabins, rough roads, a frontier that stayed a frontier longer than many other regions. People building cellars, spring houses, and dugouts into the sides of hills because that was what the terrain made easiest. There is mining, lead and zinc companies driving drifts and shafts, sometimes mapping carefully, sometimes not. Hills pierced by workings that were later abandoned, filled, or forgotten. Towns literally built over altered stone. There is conflict, Civil War skirmishes, guerrilla bands, raids, and reprisals. Evidence of caves and rock shelters used for hiding people, animals, and supplies, even when the exact locations and details have blurred. There is the long undercurrent of informal economies, moonshiners, smugglers, and small-time outlaws using the folds of the land to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. Stories of quick escapes, hidden rooms, and nighttime routes passed from one generation to the next. And there is modern research, cavers mapping networks with precise instruments, archaeologists cataloging artifacts from disturbed and undisturbed sites, historians sifting newspapers, county records, and family papers for references that either confirm or complicate the tales. All of those strands meet in the image of tunnels under town. Some parts of that image are on solid ground. It is well supported that the Ozarks are full of natural caves and that many have been used repeatedly over centuries for storage, refuge, ceremony, and work. It is well supported that mining created new underground spaces, sometimes intersecting with natural voids, sometimes running under or near later streets and buildings. It is well supported that cellars, connecting basements and short man-made passages exist in many towns, and that some were used for very practical, sometimes secretive, purposes. It is also clear that people remembered and talked about these spaces, and that printed sources, old newspapers, county histories, promotional brochures picked up and spread those memories. Where the ground becomes softer is in the grander versions. Continuous engineered tunnel systems running beneath entire downtowns, used in a coordinated way for large-scale smuggling or organized wartime escape, remain largely in the realm of possibility rather than proof. Individual stories of dramatic rescues, hidden treasure, or elaborate secret networks often hang on single testimonies, with no surviving maps or physical evidence strong enough to settle them. In some cases, clues point both ways. A collapsed void beneath a building could be a natural cave, an old mine room, or the remnant of a deliberately cut passage. Without timely documentation, it is hard to be certain. That is the space historians occupy with this mystery. They are not waiting for one lost document that will suddenly label every passage and answer every question. Instead, they are working with layers of partial evidence, survey notes that cover one hill but not the next, mining records that explain one set of shafts while leaving another rumored working unrecorded, oral histories that fit plausibly into the map of known caves but cannot be tested directly. The wrestling is ongoing, not because the evidence points clearly to a single hidden truth, but because the evidence is uneven, scattered, and sometimes missing altogether. What emerges is a picture that is neither simple debunking nor simple belief. There are real underground spaces. There are real uses that match parts of the legends. There are also gaps where the story extends beyond what can be safely claimed. Between the certainties of the bedrock and the uncertainties of legend lies a band of quiet speculation, careful inference, and respectful doubt. That is where most responsible accounts of the Ozark tunnels now live. And that in-between place may be why these stories persist so gently but so stubbornly. Hidden spaces lend themselves to memory because they mirror the way the past itself feels. Partly known, partly guessed, never entirely illuminated. They offer enough reality to hold on to, a cool draft from a cave, a stone wall under a store, an old miner's sketch on paper, while leaving room for imagination to travel further, down passages no one can quite map. As you let the details drift and blur, What remains is the sense of a landscape that has always had more going on beneath its surface than anyone could fully track. A plateau of hollows and ridges, of cellars and caves, of stories that sink and rise like groundwater. Between bedrock and legend, the Ozark tunnels are less a single riddle to be solved than a gentle reminder. Some parts of history, like some parts of the earth, are meant to stay half in shadow, quietly connecting things out of sight while life goes on above them.